Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take those really complex sources, break them down, find the key bits, and put it all back together so it makes sense for you.
And today,
Yeah.
well, today we're tackling a big one.
Yeah.
Maybe the most complex dating puzzle in, well, anywhere really. The 70 weeks prophecy, Daniel 9.
Exactly. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. It's famous, right? It predicts the Messiah, but it also tries to give this incredibly precise timeline, year by year.
Leading up to the Messiah, yes, but also, crucially, pointing to the end of, well, the end of sin itself, the end of history as we know it.
So our mission for you today, the listener, is what you've asked for. Get a quick, solid, clearly laid out understanding of this. It's super technical.
It really is.
We've got sources, as always, and they go deep into the math. We need to untangle all these variables, the different calendars they might have used, arguments about which Persian king did what when.
And how all those choices completely change the final dates you end up with. It's a minefield.
The core challenge, really, is trying to line up this prophecy given way back in the 6th century BC.
Right, to Daniel, who's working with Babylonian Hebrew ways of counting time.
And trying to sync that with our super precise modern dating, BC, AD, the whole Gregorian calendar thing.
It's like converting ancient measurements to metric,
Yeah.
but way more complicated. It's a cross-historical headache.
Okay, so before we dive into the actual numbers, let's just flag the two main sticking points. These are the forks in the road where everything diverges.
Good idea.
First, the starting point. The prophecy kicks off with a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. But which one? Was it King Artaxerxes in his 7th year? That's the one tied to Ezra?
Or was it later, in Artaxerxes' 20th year?
Yeah.
The one connected to Nehemiah building the wall.
Just picking between those two shifts, the timeline by what, over a decade?
Easily. And that's just the first problem. The second one? Oh boy. It's the math itself. What is the prophetic year in this context?
Right. Was Daniel thinking in simple round numbers? Like a 360-day year?
Which some ancient calendars sort of used. 12 months, 30 days each. Nice and neat.
Or was he supposed to be working with something closer to the actual solar year? The one we know is like 365 and a quarter days. 365.2422 to be exact.
And that tiny difference, 360 versus 365.2422. Doesn't sound like much, does it?
No, like 5 days a year.
But multiply that over nearly 5 centuries.
Ah.
And it becomes the difference between the prophecies spanning 483 years or only about 476 years.
Wow. 7 whole years just disappear, depending on how you define year.
Precisely. It vanishes from the historical timeline you're calculating.
So it forces that big question you mentioned. What was the divine intent here? Was it meant to be simple arithmetic for Daniel?
Or did God expect him, somehow, to use complex astronomical calculations that wouldn't be refined for centuries?
Okay, let's start by unpacking the units then. Get the framework straight.
Right. So the structure in Daniel 9 itself is pretty clear. It breaks the 70 weeks down.
Yeah, you've got the first bit, 7 weeks. That's supposedly for rebuilding Jerusalem, but in troublous times.
Then there's a longer stretch, 62 weeks.
Yeah.
That leads right up to the Messiah figure appearing.
And then there's that final crucial 1 week at the end.
So 7 plus 62 plus 1 equals 70 weeks. And each week is, well, 7 units. So 70 times 7 gives you 490 total units.
Okay, 490 units. But units of what? This is where the key interpretation comes in, right? The day for a year thing.
Exactly. And our sources all agree on this, pointing to other scriptures like Numbers 14 or Ezekiel 4. The principle is, in this kind of prophecy, one prophetic day equals one actual literal year.
That's fundamental. Okay, so if we accept that day for a year idea,
Which seems to be the standard interpretive key here.
then the first part, the lead up to the Messiah being cut off, that's the first 69 weeks. So 69 times 7.
Equals 483 years. That's the duration we're focused on for now. The whole prophecy covers 490 years.
483 years, got it. But now we hit that problem. How long is one of those years?
And we're back to the calendar conundrum, the 360-day year versus the solar year.
So when Daniel got this prophecy, back in exile in Babylon, what was the standard year? Why do the sources lean towards 360 days initially?
Well, that 360-day model does pop up in ancient systems. It's close to some lunar calendars and definitely resonates with the Babylonian system Daniel was immersed in. 12 months, 30 days each. Simple.
Is there scriptural evidence for that kind of counting?
Yeah, the sources often point to Genesis, like the flood story. It explicitly says 150 days covered exactly 5 months.
Ah, okay. 150 divided by 5 is 30, so 30-day months.
Right. It suggests that kind of idealized schematic calendar was sometimes used, at least for certain calculations or narratives.
But practically speaking, using only 360 days a year, that creates huge problems for farming, for festivals. It could drift out of sync with the seasons really fast.
Absolutely. You lose over 5 days every single year compared to the sun's actual cycle. That's why real-world ancient calendars, including the Hebrew one likely used after the exile, had to have adjustment mechanisms.
Like adding leap months. I think I've heard of that. Yundal, is that the term?
That's one term for it, yes. Intercalary months. They'd stick an extra month in every few years to snap the calendar back into alignment with the agricultural seasons. Passover needs to be in the spring, Tabernacles in the fall. You can't let those drift into winter or summer.
Okay, so here's the dilemma for Daniel 9, laid bare. Did God give Daniel the timeline using a perfectly simple 360-day count per year, almost like a symbolic number, ignoring all those messy real-world adjustments?
Or was the prophecy meant to be calculated using the actual time it took the Earth to go around the sun, the time that dictates the seasons, even if that meant Daniel himself couldn't calculate it perfectly back then?
Is it pure prophetic math, or is it locked to observable seasonal history?
That's the question. If it's a pure, idealized 360-day prophetic year, we stick with that number. If it's meant to precisely pinpoint a date in our historical record, we probably need to convert using the solar year.
And since we are trying to connect this to our BCA timeline, that forces the conversion issue, doesn't it? We have to use our modern understanding of the solar year.
Which we know, very accurately now, is 365.2422 days.
So if we assume the prophecy uses the 360-day year internally, but we want to map it onto our historical timeline, we have to do a conversion using the 365.2422 number.
Right. If you calculate the total number of days based on the 360-day year assumption, which we'll do in a second, and then divide that total by 365.2422, you find out how many solar years that period actually covered.
And that conversion, it actually makes the total span shorter in terms of solar years, right?
Yes, because each solar year is longer than the hypothetical 360-day year. So the same number of days fits into fewer solar years.
Okay, that's critical. And before we do that math, let's quickly clarify that BCA conversion thing you mentioned. It seems small, but you said it trips people up.
It does. It's simple but easily forgotten. When you calculate a span of time that crosses from BC to AD, you have to remember there's no year zero.
Right. It goes straight from 1 BC to 1 AD.
So if you're calculating, say, from 50 BC to 50 AD, you can't just do 50 plus 50 equals 100 years.
Why not? Oh, because you counted year 1 AD, but you didn't count year 1 BC in the same way. Let me think.
The simple rule is calculate the difference, then add 1. So 50 AD minus 950 BC is 100. But since there's no year zero, the actual elapsed time is 50 plus 51 equals 99 years if you're thinking inclusively. Or more simply, if you are calculating the interval between a BC date and an AD date, subtract the BC year number from the AD year number and subtract 1. Let's rephrase the rule to be clear. To find the number of years between year X BC and year Y AD, the formula is X plus Y 1. Example, from 1 BC to 1 AD is 1 plus 1, 1. 1 equals 1 year elapsed.
Yeah.
From 50 BC to 50 AD is 50 plus 51 equals 99 years elapsed.
Yeah.
But if we are calculating an endpoint after duration...
Okay, wait. This is the confusing part. Let's just stick to the idea that when calculating an end date from a BC start date across the BCA boundary, we need to be careful because there's no zero year.
Exactly. If you start in BC and calculate forward 483 years, you don't just subtract the start year from 483. You have to account for that jump from 1 BC to 1 AD. So start year BC minus 483 years plus 1 and year AD. Or rather, let's simplify. 483 years, start year BC plus 1 equals and year AD. Example, start 483 BC and is 483 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, 8026.
Okay, 483 minus the BC year plus 1 gives the AD year. That makes sense. We just need to remember that plus 1 adjustment for the missing zero.
We must. Forgetting it throws you off by a full year, which is a huge deal when you're trying to hit a specific historical target.
Wow. Okay, so the weight this whole discussion carries, it's huge. We're talking about whether Daniel needed like a calculator and astronomical charts or just simple counting based on the calendar system he knew.
That's the theological implication, isn't it? Was the prophecy meant to be immediately or at least potentially understandable?
Or was its full precision locked away until modern science could decode it?
If it was meant to be understood by people back then, or certainly by the time of Christ, the simpler approach, using the 483 years as basically 483 real seasonal years, seems more logical. They knew how to count 483 years using their adjusted calendars.
Right, let's get into the actual math for those first 69 weeks. That's the 483-year period leading up to the Messiah. Let's lay out those two scenarios again clearly.
Okay. Scenario A, we take the literal prophetic years approach. We basically ignore the solar correction for the duration. We say one prophetic year equals 360 days, and the total span is 69 weeks, which we already calculated as 483 years.
So under this view, the duration is just 483 years, full stop.
Well, to be precise with the days, if you use the 360-day definition strictly, 483 years times 360 days per year gives you, let me check the number, 173,880 days.
173,880 prophetic days.
Correct. Now, the argument for scenario A is often that God meant 483 calendar years, the kind Daniel would have understood, which already had leap months built in to track the seasons. So the end result in history would simply be 483 solar years later. The 360-day thing might just be a symbolic layer or a calculation base.
Okay, so scenario A essentially argues the duration is 483 solar years, maybe derived from a 360-day count, but ultimately matching real time.
That's one way to see it, yeah. It prioritizes the number 483.
Now, scenario B, the solar-corrected years. This one takes that day count seriously.
Right. Scenario B says that 173,880 days is the absolute fixed duration given by God. And if we want to know how long that is in our calendar, we must convert it using the precise solar year.
So we take the total days, 173,880,
And we divide that by the length of the modern solar year, 365.2422 days.
Okay, calculator time. 173,880 divided by 365.2422. It comes out to 476.06 years. 476.06. So basically 476 years for dating purposes. Exactly. Our sources round it to 476 solar years.
And there it is. That's the 7-year difference. Scenario A gives 483 years. Scenario B gives 476 years.
It's a stark difference built entirely on how you interpret year and whether you convert the total day count.
Let's think about those 7 years again. If you're trying to pinpoint, say, the crucifixion, landing 7 years too early or 7 years too late is massive.
It's the difference between hitting the accepted historical window for Christ's ministry and death, or missing it completely, landing perhaps even before his ministry began.
So let's revisit that theological question about intent. If scenario B, the 476-year span, is correct, what does that imply?
It implies, as we touched on, that the prophecy's precise timing was mathematically veiled. Daniel himself couldn't have done the 365.2422 calculation.
Nobody could, not accurately for centuries.
So was the full clarity intended only for a much later generation, one with advanced astronomical knowledge? That seems counterintuitive for prophecy, which is usually meant as a sign for those anticipating fulfillment.
Or did God use the numbers Daniel could work with, like 483 years, based on the calendar systems of the time, which did track seasons via adjustments, precisely so that the fulfillment could be recognized by the people living in the 1st century AD?
That's the argument for scenario A, the 483-year interpretation. It favors simplicity, comprehensibility. Prophecy elsewhere uses straightforward numbers, 3 days, 40 years, 7 years, usually corresponding to literal time periods.
They argue if some complex solar correction was needed, wouldn't the text have hinted at it?
You'd think so. On the other hand, proponents of scenario B, the 476-year solar adjustment, they prioritize alignment with our precise historical astronomical timescale.
Their argument is, if you want to peg this prophecy to a specific BCA date, you have to use the scientifically accurate length of a year. Otherwise, your mapping is flawed.
It's a tension between original context simplicity and modern historical scientific precision. The sources we looked at don't definitively crown a winner.
But you mentioned a trend.
Yeah, as we go through the actual date calculations next, we'll see that the simpler 483-year calculation often lands closer to the generally accepted historical dates for Jesus' life than the 476-year one does. But not always. It depends on the start date, too.
Okay, enough about the duration. Let's talk about the starting gun. The prophecy says it begins with a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. We need to find that decree in history.
And that means looking at the Persian king Artaxerxes, specifically Artaxerxes I, also called Longivanus.
Our sources zoom in on 2 main possibilities during his reign, right?
Yes. Option 1 is linked to his 7th year as king. This is the decree mentioned in the book of Ezra, chapter 7. It's associated with Ezra himself going up to Jerusalem.
What was Ezra focused on? More the religious side. Restoring the law, the temple worship.
Primarily, yes. Establishing the legal and religious framework, although restoring the community implies some level of rebuilding.
Okay, so Artaxerxes year 7, Ezra. What's option 2?
Option 2 is later, Artaxerxes' 20th year. This one is strongly connected to Nehemiah.
Ah, Nehemiah. He was the wall builder.
Yeah, exactly. Nehemiah chapter 6 even gives a specific date for the wall's completion, 25th of Elul. This decree seems more focused on the physical security and structure of the city. Restore and build Jerusalem.
So, 2 plausible decrees. Year 7, Ezra, and year 20, Nehemiah. But wait, you said earlier that even Artaxerxes' reign dates are debated.
Oh yeah, here comes the next layer of complexity. When did Artaxerxes actually become king? His accession year, year 1.
Don't tell me there are 2 options for that, too.
Bingo. Depending on how you interpret ancient records, co-regencies with his father Xerxes, astronomical tablets. Historians place his accession year 1 either in BC 464
Okay, 464 BC.
or a full decade earlier in BC 474.
Seriously, a 10-year swing on when the king started ruling.
Welcome to the joys of ancient chronology. It's based on piecing together often conflicting fragments of evidence.
Okay, let me get this straight. We have
2 possible decrees, year 7 or year 20.
2 possible start dates for the king's reign. Accession year 1 equals BC 464 OR BC 474.
And 2 possible ways to calculate the 69 weeks. 483 years or R 476 years.
That's 2 times 2 times 2. That's 8 different combinations, 8 possible end dates we need to calculate, all trying to land on the Messiah's arrival.
That's the calculation matrix we have to work through. Let's do it systematically. We'll start with the earlier decree, year 7, linked to Ezra.
Scenario 1-to-1. Let's use the more standard accession year first, BC 464. If U1 is BC 464, then Artaxerxes' 7th year is BC 458.
Okay, BC 458 is our starting point, and I'll apply the first calendar, the simple prophetic 483 years.
Okay, using our rule, 483 years minus 458 BC plus 1 equals AD 26.
AD 26. Now that is interesting.
Why? What happened around AD 26?
Well, if it's very comfortably within the time frame for John the Baptist starting his ministry or Jesus beginning his own public ministry, maybe his baptism, it marks the Messiah appearing on the scene.
So BC 458 start plus 483 years, AD 26. That looks pretty good, actually.
It's a strong contender, definitely. But now, same start date, BC 458, let's apply the other calendar, the solar-corrected 476 years.
Okay, 476 years minus 458 BC plus 1. That gives AD 19.
AD 19. How does that look?
Much less convincing. If the 69 weeks are supposed to culminate with the Messiah's work, starting AD 19 seems way too early. Jesus would have been, what, early 20s maybe? His ministry started around age 30, traditionally.
Exactly. It doesn't align well with the gospel accounts. So this result suggests that if BC 458 is the correct start date, the 483-year calculation leading to AD 26 is much more plausible than the 476-year one leading to AD 19.
Okay, makes sense. Now let's try the other possible accession year for Artaxerxes. Scenario 1-2. What if his reign started earlier in BC 474?
If accession year 1 equals BC 474, then his 7th year, the decree date, is BC 468.
Okay, start date BC 468. Let's use the prophetic 483 years first. 483 minus 468 plus 1 equals AD 16.
AD 16. Still feels too early for the main events, right?
Yeah, very early. So this combination, BC 474 accession year 7 decree 483 years, doesn't look great either.
Now, for the calculation that really raises eyebrows, according to the sources, same start date, BC 468, but use the solar-corrected 476 years.
Okay, 476 minus 468 plus 1 equals 89.
89.
Wait, AG9 as in single digits.
Yeah, 89.
If the 69 weeks end then, and the Messiah is cut off shortly after, that would mean Jesus died or fulfilled this part of the prophecy when he was maybe 12 years old, like when he was amazing the teachers in the temple.
Precisely. It's chronologically impossible based on everything else we know. The Gospels place his ministry under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, which started around AD 14.
So 89 is just out. It can't work.
And that's why this specific calculation is important. It acts as a kind of negative proof. It strongly suggests that the combination of the BC 474 accession year and the solar-corrected 476 year count must be wrong. The math leads to an impossible historical outcome.
Okay, so we can probably set aside the BC 474 accession year, especially when combined with the solar correction. That helps narrow things down.
Let's move to the second potential decree then, Artaxerxes' 20th year, linked to Nehemiah and the wall.
And let's go back to the more standard accession year, BC 464, scenario 2-1. If year 1 is BC 464, then year 20 is BC 445.
Correct. Start date BC 445. Let's apply the prophetic 483 years first.
Okay. 483 minus 445 plus 1 equals AD 39.
AD 39. What do you think?
That seems too late. If the crucifixion was around 8030, or maybe 8033 at the latest, according to most scholars, 8039 is pushing it quite a bit. It feels like it misses the mark on the other side.
Agreed. It falls outside the generally accepted window for Christ's death.
Yep.
So this suggests that if the starting decree was BC 445, the simple 483-year count is probably not the right one.
Okay, so same start date, BC 445, but now try the solar-corrected 476 years.
Right. 476 minus 445 plus 1 equals 8032.
8032. Now that is interesting,
Why?
because 8032 falls smack dab in the middle of the plausible range for the crucifixion. Many scholars argue for 8030, others for 8033, but 8032 is definitely a strong candidate.
It is. So this combination, the BC 445 decree in Nehemiah, couples with the mathematically precise 476-year solar correction, lands us right in a very plausible year for the end of the 69 weeks, coinciding with the Messiah being cut off.
This makes the later decree, year 20, BC 445, look very viable if you accept the solar correction math.
Exactly. Now, just to be thorough, let's briefly look at the less likely accession year again with this later decree. Scenario 2-2. What if accession year 1 was BC 474?
Then year 20 would be BC 455.
Okay, start date BC 455. Let's try the prophetic 483 years. 483 minus 455 plus 1 equals 8029.
AD 29, that's another really strong date.
It is. It's just 1 year off the traditional 80-30 crucifixion date. For those who favored the simple 483-year count, this combination, BC 474 accession year, 20 decree 483 years, looks very appealing.
It lines up almost perfectly.
But what happens if we take that same BC 455 start date and apply the solar corrected 476 years?
Let's see, 476 minus 455 plus 1 equals 8022.
8022, and we're back to being too early again.
Yeah, 8022 doesn't fit the timeline of the ministry and crucifixion.
So putting it all together, the calculations seem to eliminate some options, like the ones leading to 89 or 8016 or 8022, and strongly favor others.
It really boils down to two main pathways, doesn't it? Either you start early with Ezra's decree, BC 458, and use the simple 483-year count to get 8026.
Which fits the start of the ministry.
Or you start later with Nehemiah's decree, BC 445 or maybe BC 455, and you have to pick the right calendar to match. The 476-year solar correction with BC 445 gives 8032 plausible crucifixion.
And the 483-year simple count with BC 455 gives AD 29, also plausible crucifixion ministry end.
Wow. So the math itself seems to force connections between the start date and the calendar method. You can't just mix and match arbitrarily if you want a result that makes historical sense.
Precisely. The calculations constrain the possibilities. And interestingly, they all point towards the fulfillment landing squarely in that crucial period of the early 1st century AD, somewhere between AD 26 and AD 32.
Okay, since we've managed to narrow down the likely end date window so much, let's try flipping the logic. Let's do that reverse engineering you mentioned.
Good idea. Instead of starting with Artaxerxes and calculating forward, let's start with the event the Messiah being cut off. Assume a date for it and calculate backward to see what start date would have been required.
And what's the most common consensus date for the end of the 69 weeks, meaning the crucifixion?
The sources we looked at, reflecting general scholarship, tend to favor around AD 30 for the crucifixion. Some might lean towards AD 33, but AD 30 is a very common anchor point. Let's use that.
Okay, anchor date, AD 30. Now let's work backward using the first duration, the simple prophetic 483 years.
If the endpoint is AD 30, we need to find the start date 483 years before that. Remembering the no year zero rule, we calculate 483 years minus AD 30 minus 1 equals the BC year. So 483.29 equals 454. The required start date is BC 454.
BC 454. Now let's connect that back to Artaxerxes. If that required BC 454 decree was his 7th year, Ezra.
Then his accession year 1 must have been BC 454 plus 71 equals BC 460.
Oh,
Glad
good.
we checked that logic. Year 7 is BC 454. Year 1 is 6 years earlier. BC 460 sounds right.
Okay, implied accession BC 460. What if the BC 454 decree was his 20th year, Nehemiah?
Then accession year 1 would be 19 years earlier. BC 454 plus 19 equals BC 473. Let's re-verify. Year 20 equals BC 454. Year 1 equals BC 454 plus 21 equals BC 473. Yes.
So if we assume 8030 crucifixion and the 483-year count, Artaxerxes must have started his reign in either BC 460 or BC 473. Are those plausible dates?
They absolutely are. Remember, the two main options historians debate were BC 464 and BC 474. BC 460 and BC 473 fall right within that range of uncertainty. That's a pretty strong confirmation, actually.
It shows the math lines up with the historical possibilities using that simple 483-year duration. Okay, now let's do the same thing with the other duration. The solar-adjusted 476 years. Anchor date is still AD30.
Okay, we need to go back 476 years from AD30 using the same logic. 476 years minus AD30 minus 1, ED30 minus 1. 476 29 equals 447. The required start date is BC 447.
BC 447, okay, map that back. If the decree in BC 447 was Artaxerxes' 7th year,
Accession year 1 would be BC 447 plus 71 will be BC 463.
and if a BC 447 decree was his 20th year,
Accession year 1 would be BC 447 plus 21 BC 466.
so under the solar-adjusted 476-year model, the implied accession years are BC 453 or BC 466. Are those plausible?
Yes, again, they fall well within the debated range, BC 474, BC 464. BC 466 is very close to the commonly cited BC 464. BC 453 is a bit earlier than usually proposed, but perhaps not impossible, depending on the specific ancient evidence you prioritize.
This reverse calculation is really powerful. It basically says, look, if you accept AD30 as the endpoint, then regardless of whether you use 483 years or 476 years, the necessary start date implies an accession year for Artaxerxes that fits within the known historical debates.
Exactly. It confirms that the whole prophetic structure is chronologically coherent within the known historical parameters. The numbers work.
It shifts the debate, like you said. It's less about did Daniel get the math right and more about which specific year did Artaxerxes start ruling and which decree fits the prophetic language best.
And it reinforces the conclusion from our forward calculations. The viable scenarios seem to be early decree around BC 458-454 plus 483 years, or later decree around BC 447-445 plus 476 years. Both pathways lead to a fulfillment right around the time of Christ.
The big takeaway then from this whole deep dive into the first 69 weeks is that despite the complexities, the prophecy demonstrably points to the time of Jesus.
Without a doubt. The predictive accuracy spanning nearly 5 centuries is remarkable, whichever precise calculation path you favor. The end date lands right on that generation.
That certainty about the first part, the 69 weeks, is what makes the next part so critical, the 70th week.
Right. We spent all this time showing the 69 weeks, the 483 or 476 years were fulfilled. They ended around AD30, give or take a few years.
When Messiah came, he was cut off, just as predicted. Check.
But then, silence. The prophetic clock seems to stop. Because here we are 2,000 years later.
And the ultimate goals of the prophecy, listed back in Daniel 9.24, clearly haven't happened yet.
Exactly. That verse talks about finishing transgression, putting an end to sin, atoning for wickedness, bringing in everlasting righteousness, sealing up vision and prophecy, and anointing the most holy.
Has sin ended? Clearly not. Is everlasting righteousness fully established? Nope.
So the 70th week, that final 7-year period which is supposed to accomplish all those things, cannot have run immediately after the 69th. It just doesn't fit history.
This leads to the inescapable conclusion presented in our sources. There must be a gap, a pause in the prophetic timeline.
A potentially long pause, as history has shown, between the end of the 69th week, around Christ's death ascension, and the beginning of the 70th week.
So the clock stopped ticking around AD 30, and it hasn't started again yet.
That's the logical inference based on the text and history. The cross was profoundly important, the basis for ending sin. But it wasn't the final tick of the 70-week clock itself.
Why not? What was still missing, according to the source material's interpretation,
Because the possibility of sin, the existence of transgression against God's law, wasn't removed from creation at the cross. Death still reigned. The conditions of Daniel 9.24 require the actual cessation of sin's power and potential.
So the Great Atonement, in its absolute fullest sense, wiping out the very capacity for sin that's reserved for the events within that final 70th week.
That's how the sources frame it. The final 7 years are when the work accomplished potentially at the cross is fully and finally applied and demonstrated, resulting in sin's permanent end.
Okay, let's focus entirely on this future, imminent 7-year period, the 70th week. What kicks it off? How does the clock start ticking again?
According to Daniel 9.27, the final week begins when a specific figure confirms a covenant or a treaty with many, for 1 week that is, for 7 years.
And who is this figure that makes the covenant? The sources identify him as?
The sources identify this figure with the Antichrist, specifically drawing from the language, the people of the prince who is to come, who destroy the city and sanctuary, linking back to the Romans, they interpret this final covenant maker as the leader representing the final manifestation of that same power system.
And you mentioned the source identifies this system with the beast power, tracing it from Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and ultimately seeing its later form in the papacy.
Yes, the source material does make that specific connection, viewing the Antichrist figure as operating through that historical trajectory of global power, which it identifies with the papacy or Babylonian papal power, confirming this final 7-year covenant.
Okay, so we're neutrally reporting that specific interpretation from the source.
Yeah.
This covenant starts the 7-year clock. What happens next?
That 7-year period gets split right down the middle, 3.5 years in.
Ah, the famous 3.5 years. That number appears everywhere, doesn't it? Time, times, and half a time, 42 months, 1,260 days.
Exactly. They all refer to the second half of this final week. It's often called the Great Tribulation.
And what happens at that midpoint, the 3.5-year mark, that's so significant?
That's when the covenant maker, the Antichrist figure, breaks the agreement. Daniel 9.27 says he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering.
Stopping the sacrifices, and then?
And then he sets up the abomination of desolation. This act is the major trigger for the intense events of the second half of the week.
You mentioned a translation nuance here.
Yes, the source noted that some translations might imply the abomination appears at the halfway point, while others, which the source prefers, suggest it's set up during or as part of the action of stopping the sacrifice, effectively marking the start of that final 1,260-day period. It's a subtle distinction about the exact timing trigger.
Okay, so the abomination is set up, sacrifices stop. This kicks off the final intense 3.5 years. What characterizes this period?
Intense persecution. This is when the beast power, that composite entity representing Satan working through world systems, exercises its greatest authority.
It targets.
It targets the saints, those who remain faithful to God and refuse to comply with the beast's demands, particularly those upholding the commandments. The pressure is immense.
Then the timeline gets even more specific, moving from years to days. You mentioned 1,290 days and 1,335 days from Daniel 12.
Yes. Daniel 12 mentions a period of 1,290 days from the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination is set up. But then it says, "Blessed is he who waits," and reaches the end of the 1,335 days.
So an extra 45 days beyond the 1,290. What happens at the 1,335-day mark? What's the blessing?
The source connects this 1,335-day mark directly to the first resurrection.
The resurrection of the righteous dead, the martyrs.
Yes, and this is presented as the climactic fulfillment of the 70 weeks purpose.
How so? Why is the resurrection the key to ending sin and bringing in everlasting righteousness?
Because, according to the source's logic, sin is transgression of God's law, the commandments. The Antichrist power persecutes those who uphold the law. When these faithful saints are resurrected 1,335 days after the abomination is set up.
It's like God is publicly vindicating them.
Exactly. Their resurrection becomes the ultimate, undeniable proof that God's law is true, righteous, and leads to life, while the beast's way leads to death. It demonstrates the superiority of obedience over rebellion.
And this act of resurrection, it changes things for those raised.
It permanently secures them in righteousness.
Yeah.
The source argues that this event confirms the truth of the commandments so powerfully that it removes the very possibility of sin for the resurrected. The Great Atonement is fully realized for them. Everlasting righteousness is established. The conditions of Daniel 9.24 are finally met.
Wow, so the 70 weeks prophecy isn't truly fulfilled until that first resurrection event, 1,335 days into the final half week.
That's the interpretation presented. The cross laid the foundation, but the resurrection is the capstone that achieves the final goals.
And while this is happening, the resurrection, the atonement being secured, what's going on back on earth for everyone else.
Simultaneously, the source indicates God's judgment is being poured out on the beast power and those who followed it. This takes the form of the 7 last plagues described in Revelation.
Okay, so resurrection for the saints, plagues for the wicked. How does it all wrap up?
It culminates in the visible, glorious return of Christ.
The second coming.
Yes, he returns, judges the armies gathered against him, often associated with Armageddon. The beast and the false prophet are captured and thrown into the lake of fire.
And that marks the absolute end.
That marks the completion of the 70 weeks prophecy. History as we know it, Adam's history of sin, ends. Sin is dealt with, righteousness is established, and this ushers in the next era.
The 1,000-year kingdom, the millennium.
Correct. The 1,000 years of peace, often seen as the Sabbath millennium, the great time of rest, echoing the creation week.
This framing really shifts the focus, doesn't it? The historical calculations for the first 69 weeks are important because they validate the prophecy.
They prove its divine origin and reliability.
But the real action, the ultimate fulfillment, is all packed into that future, final 7-year week, specifically culminating 1,335 days after the abomination is set up.
Yes, it means we're living in the gap right now. The historical debate about BC 458 versus BC 445 is interesting, but it pales in significance compared to understanding the events that will trigger and unfold during that final decisive week. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, that was a lot. A truly deep dive into the numbers and the narrative. Let's try to synthesize the main takeaways for you, the listener.
I think the first key point is that the difficulty in dating the first 69 weeks wasn't really theological, was it? It was purely mathematical and historical.
Right. It all hinged on nailing down two things. Which Artaxerxes' decree started the clock? Was it year 7 around BC 458 or year 20 around BC 445?
And second, how do you count the years? Was it the simple prophetic count resulting in 483 years? Or did you need the precise solar correction giving 476 years?
But the amazing thing is, as we saw, no matter which plausible combination of those variables you pick,
the end date lands remarkably close to the time of the Messiah, somewhere between AD 26 and AD 32.
which strongly validates the prophecy's claim. The first part was demonstrably fulfilled right on schedule.
Absolutely. That historical fulfillment gives us confidence in the second part.
And that's the big shift in focus. The 69 weeks are history. We're living in the 2,000-year gap. So prophetically speaking, all eyes are now on what starts that final 7-year clock.
That covenant confirmed by the Antichrist figure. That's the next major event on the prophetic timeline, according to Daniel 9.
It's also fascinating looking back at the calculations that the simpler method, the 483-year count.
Yeah, that often yielded dates like AD 26 or AD 29, which arguably fit the historical accounts even better than some results from the more complex 476-year solar calculation.
Which kind of suggests maybe God did intend it to be understandable using the methods available at the time. Simple divine math, not complex astronomy needed centuries later.
It certainly leans that way, prioritizing comprehensibility for the generation anticipating fulfillment.
Okay, so here's the final provocative thought the source material leaves us grappling with. The whole point of the 70 weeks, according to Daniel 9.24, is to finish transgression, put an end to sin, and bring in everlasting righteousness.
Goals that clearly weren't fully met 2,000 years ago at the cross, even though the basis was laid. Sin and death still exist.
So the question becomes, what specific condition is finally met during that intense final 7-year week, particularly at that 1,335-day mark after the abomination that actually achieves those ultimate goals?
How does the first resurrection definitively prove the commandments and secure the great atonement in a way that permanently removes the capacity for sin from creation?
That precise mechanism, tied to the resurrection 1,335 days into the tribulation, seems to be the key that unlocks the final fulfillment of this ancient, incredibly detailed prophecy.
It connects Daniel's numbers directly to the ultimate redemption story, the final countdown.
Something to definitely keep thinking about. We hope this deep dive gave you the clarity and structure you needed to wrap your head around this complex timeline. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.